Tom Harper sat in his dimly lit living room, the only illumination coming from the flickering glow of the old radio perched precariously on the edge of his cluttered workbench. The static hissed and crackled like a swarm of restless bees, filling the air with a tense, almost electric charge. Tom's pale fingers trembled as he adjusted the dial minutely, seeking that elusive frequency where the voices lurked beneath the static's veil. The voices had grown louder over the past days, more insistent, more fragmented. Sometimes they whispered in unintelligible murmurs, like distant echoes from a forgotten dream, but there were moments when clarity broke through like shards of glass. And then there was Claire's voice, faint but unmistakable, shattered and fractured by static, yet undeniably hers. Tom, the sound was barely audible, a fragile thread weaving through the crackling interference. The single word sent a jolt through his chest, a mixture of hope and a stabbing pain he hadn't felt since her death. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the radio's glass face, straining to catch her next words. "It's coming, darkness. Don't let it in." The warning was fragmented, the static swallowing parts of her message, but the urgency was unmistakable. Tom's heart hammered wildly. Was it a hallucination, a cruel trick of his mind? Or was Claire reaching out to him from beyond the veil, desperate to warn him? The room felt colder suddenly, the shadows in the corners lengthening and deepening. Tom shivered, wrapping his arms around himself, fighting the rising tide of fear and grief that threatened to engulf him. Days earlier, he had confided in Margaret Lane, the local librarian and one of the few people willing to entertain his growing obsession without dismissing him outright. Together, they had spent hours combing through old archives, dusty newspapers, and faded photographs in the cavernous silence of the library. Margaret's sharp eyes and calm demeanor were a steadying force amid the storm of Tom's unraveling thoughts. "Look at this," Margaret said one afternoon, her finger tracing the yellowed pages of a century-old diary. "There have been similar incidents before, people hearing voices, strange broadcasts, disappearances. This town has a history of grief feeding something dark." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of their discovery sinking in. The radios weren't just picking up random interference or static, they were a conduit, a bridge between worlds. And the darkness Claire warned about was drawing nearer. Outside, the town seemed unchanged, but Tom sensed a shift. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken dread, a collective tension simmering beneath the surface. As dusk fell, he walked the quiet streets, the hum of radios from nearby houses blending with the whispering wind. It felt as if unseen eyes followed his every step, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting. Back home, exhaustion clawed at his mind, but sleep eluded him. The radio static morphed into a piercing shriek, a sudden cacophony that made his hands jump. Then, through the chaos, Claire's voice fractured but urgent. "Tom, protect them, before it's too late." The message shattered the fragile barrier between sanity and madness. Tom gasped, clutching his head as a wave of panic crashed over him. Was this a desperate plea from beyond, or the despair of a broken mind conjuring ghosts to torment him? He sank to the floor, breath ragged, caught between hope and horror. The fractured frequencies whispered their dreadful secrets, and Tom knew there was no turning back. The darkness was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would test the limits of his grief, his courage, and his very soul. His fingers found the radio dial once more, the static swirling like a living thing. He tuned in, ready to listen, ready to fight though. The boundary between the living and the dead was growing thinner with every passing moment. Outside, the night deepened, and the town held its breath. The town hall was packed beyond its modest capacity, the air thick with unease and whispered speculation. Tom Harper sat near the back, shoulders hunched beneath his threadbare coat, eyes flicking nervously toward the front where a hastily arranged panel of town officials and concerned residents attempted to maintain order. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pallid, flickering glow that seemed to deepen the shadows pooling in corners and beneath tired eyes. Voices rose and fell in waves, some cautious, others outright accusatory. "It's the radios," a woman said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Those voices sit like they're reaching into our homes, into our minds. What are we supposed to do?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and frustration. Tom's gaze fixed on the faces around him, their expressions a mirror of his own turmoil. Grief, anxiety, suspicion. It was as if the entire town's sorrow had congealed into this palpable, suffocating cloud. Margaret Lane stood near the podium, her posture calm but alert. She raised a hand for silence, and the room gradually stilled. "We know that these broadcasts are more than mere interference," she began, voice steady though edged with concern. "Several of us have experienced strange phenomena, voices that seem aware, warnings that defy explanation. I've been digging through the town's archives, and I believe there's a history here we've overlooked." Tom's heart pounded. He had urged Margaret to pursue this line of inquiry ever since her initial skepticism had softened. Now, her words gave shape to the dread that had been gnawing at him in sleepless nights filled with static whispers. Later that evening, Tom found himself in the dim confines of the library's archive room. Dust motes swirled in the narrow beams of light cast by an old desk lamp. Margaret sat opposite him, her fingers tracing the spine of a worn, leather-bound diary. The musty scent of aged paper filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of the building's heating system. "This belonged to one of the town's earliest residents," Margaret said softly, opening the book to reveal delicate, yellowed pages crowded with tight, looping script. "Sarah Whitmore. She documented a series of strange events, voices on the radio. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, all dating back almost a century." Tom leaned in, eyes scanning the fragile text. The entries were unsettling, descriptions of voices speaking through static, warnings of an encroaching darkness, and a desperate plea to remember the past, lest it consume the present. Each page seemed to throb with a silent echo of sorrow, a resonance that stirred something deep within Tom's own grief. "It's like the hollow presence has been here all along," Tom murmured, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Feeding on the town's pain, growing stronger with every loss." Margaret nodded, her gaze grave. "And every time it rises, the cycle repeats. We need to understand it if we're to break free." Meanwhile, Eli Jacobs sat behind the soundboard at the local radio station, the stale air thick with the scent of coffee and worn electronics. His fingers hovered over the controls, adjusting dials as static crackled through the speakers. That familiar sneer of skepticism he wore in public was tempered now by a flicker of unease. The interference was no longer just background noise. It had a rhythm, a pattern that defied logical explanation. "Tom," Eli said during a late-night call, voice low and serious, "I don't know what's going on, but this isn't normal. The signal's there, almost like messages. Something's trying to communicate." Tom's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. "I've been hearing Claire's voice," he confessed. "She's warning me. I'm starting to believe you," Eli admitted, the weight of his words hanging heavily between them. Days passed in a blur of research and restless nights. Tom and Margaret pored over newspapers, police reports, and the diary's haunting entries. The radio's static was a constant companion, a sinister soundtrack underscoring their efforts. At times, Claire's fractured voice slipped through the noise, a fragile lifeline tethering Tom to a reality he struggled to hold on to. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the library's windows, Tom whispered, "It's like the town itself is alive with grief. The hollow presence feeds on it, twisting memories and fears into something darker." Margaret's eyes met his, steady and resolute. "Then we have to be stronger. We have to fight back." But even as they resolved to act, the shadows lengthened both in the town and within Tom's heart. The resonance of past sorrows echoed louder, threatening to drown out the fragile hope they clung to. The chapter closes with Tom standing alone outside the library, the diary clutched tightly in his hands. The night air is thick with the scent of rain and static, carrying with it a whisper of warning that chills him to the bone. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackles to life, and Claire's voice, faint but unmistakable, cuts through the silence. "He's coming." Tom's breath catches. The battle was only just beginning. The room was drowned in static. It filled the corners, seeped into the walls, and wrapped itself tightly around Tom like a suffocating shroud. He sat, slumped in the chair by the window, the old radio perched on the battered table before him, crackling with an otherworldly noise that was more than mere interference. There was a pulsing cadence to it, almost like a heartbeat in ease, irregular, as if the static itself was alive and breathing. Tom's gaze was fixed on the radio's flickering dial, each twitch of its needle echoing the rhythm embedded in the white noise. His fingers trembled as they hovered near the tuning knob, reluctant to adjust for fear of losing the fragile thread that connected him to the spectral transmissions. And yet, the voices remained elusive, swallowed beneath layers of distortion and silence. Suddenly, the radio fell silent. The static vanished as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving a vacuum that pressed against Tom's lungs and made his breath shallow. The absence of sound was overwhelming an oppressive quiet that filled the room with a weight far heavier than the noise before it. His skin prickled, a chill crawling up his spine as if the silence itself was a presence, watching and waiting. He swallowed hard, eyes darting around the shadowed corners of the living room as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing, only the heavy stillness that seemed to throb with a sinister energy. In that moment, the boundary between the living and dead felt perilously thin, as if the hollow presence was testing its limits, probing for weakness. Tom's mind wavered, memories flickering erratically, like broken film reels caught in a malfunctioning projector. Claire's voice, once a soothing balm, warped into something chilling and distorted. Her warmth twisted into urgent whispers that clawed at his heart. Fragments of warnings and pleas tangled with static that hissed and crackled like a storm. He shut his eyes tightly, willing the images away, but the haunting chorus persisted. The memories blended with hallucinations, the scent of her hair, the touch of her hand, the sound of her laughter, all slipping through his grasp like smoke. Grief and fear intertwined, knitting a web from which he struggled to break free. Desperate for grounding, Tom reached for his phone and dialed Margaret. The line connected with a faint crackle, and her calm voice answered, steady as ever, despite the turmoil swirling within him. "Tom, are you all right? You sound distant." He took a ragged breath, struggling to find words. "It's the radio, the static, it's different now. It's like it's alive, Margaret. I can feel it twisting my memories, warping everything. I don't know what's real anymore." There was a pause, then she replied, "You're not alone in this. I've been digging through the archives. There's more to this town's history than you realize, tragedies linked to these broadcasts. It's like the hollow presence feeds on our grief, twisting reality to gain power. You have to hold on, Tom. We need to understand it before it's too late." Her words were a fragile lifeline, an anchor in the storm of Tom's unraveling thoughts. Despite the overwhelming dread, a flicker of resolve ignited within him. He would not let this darkness consume him or the people he cared about. He would fight, no matter the cost. As the call ended, the radio crackled once more to life, the static intensifying into a roar that drowned out every other sound. Amid the chaos, a voice emerged, Claire's voice fragmented, but unmistakably hers, carrying a warning laced with urgency and sorrow. "Tom, it's coming. Protect them, protect yourself." The room seemed to pulse with the weight of her words, and the hollow presence made itself known not just as a force of grief, but as a predator lurking in the static shadows. Tom's hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. The battle ahead was no longer just about hearing the voices. It was about confronting the darkness that sought to unravel everything he held dear. The line between memory and nightmare blurred, but his determination remained steadfast. Outside, the night deepened, and the radio's static sang its hollow song. A siren call that beckoned the living and the dead toward an unknown fate, and Tom Harper would answer. The next morning, the town seemed deceptively normal. The sun filtered weakly through grey clouds, casting a muted light over streets that bore the marks of quiet desperation. Tom met Margaret at the library, her sharp eyes immediately noting the fatigue etched into his face. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, guiding him to a table piled with yellowed papers and brittle books. Tom sat heavily, rubbing his temples. The hollow presence sits stronger. I can feel it manipulating my memories, twisting Claire's voice into something I don't recognize. It's like it's trying to break me. Margaret nodded, her expression grave. The diaries I found mentioned similar experiences. People losing themselves, caught between reality and something else. The entity thrives on grief, feeding off the pain and confusion. She slid a worn notebook across the table. This belonged to a man from a century ago, who wrote about voices on the radio, though of course they had different means then. The pattern repeats. Tom flipped through the pages, the faded ink revealing tales of loss and madness, warnings echoing through time. It was as if the hollow presence was an ancient force, awakened by the sorrow that clung to the town like a second skin. "So how do we fight it?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated. "We don't know yet, but knowledge is our first weapon. We have to understand its nature, the source of its power. Then maybe we can find a way to sever the connection." The library's quiet was pierced by the sudden crackle of a radio from a nearby desk. Tom and Margaret exchanged a glance, the sound a reminder of the invisible war unfolding around them. Outside, whispers of static drifted on the wind, the hollow presence growing bolder, its shadow stretching ever wider. Tom's fight had only just begun. That evening, Tom returned home, the house feeling colder and emptier than before. He sat by the window, the radio humming softly beside him. The static was thicker now, almost tactile, as if the air itself was charged with unseen menace. He closed his eyes and listened, focusing on the fragmented voices within the noise. Claire's voice pierced through, clearer than ever, yet laced with an urgency that made his heart ache. "Listen, Tom. The boundary thins. The dark comes for the living. You must be strong." The words faded into the static, replaced by a sudden silence so complete it rang in his ears. Then came a low, rumbling sound, like something shifting deep beneath the earth, or a distant storm gathering force. Tom's breath caught. The hollow presence was not content to remain hidden in whispers. It was moving, growing, and it had set its sights on him. His fingers found the tuning knob, twisting it slowly as if trying to tune the darkness itself out. But the static only grew louder, a roaring tide threatening to engulf his mind. With a shuddering breath, Tom straightened. "I won't let you take everything," he whispered into the gathering night. "Not again." The radio crackled violently, a burst of white noise exploding through the silence. And beneath it all, Claire's voice, fragile but fierce. "Hold on, Tom. The fight is just beginning." Outside the window, shadows deepened, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The hollow presence was here, and Tom Harper was ready to face it. The static thickened once again, and Tom's world teetered on the edge of the known and the unfathomable. The fight for his mind, his memories, and his very soul was underway. The hollow presence was no longer a distant threat, it was a living shadow, a whisper in the dark, and a nightmare made real. And Tom Harper would not falter. The hall was packed, the air thick with a restless murmur that seemed to vibrate with static itself. Faces were drawn tight with fear and confusion, eyes darting nervously toward the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Tom sat near the back, clutching the small radio that had become his lifeline. Its incessant crackle a grim reminder of the thin veil between the living world and the realm beyond. Margaret stood at the front, her voice calm but edged with urgency as she recounted the disturbing patterns buried deep within the town's history. "These aren't isolated incidents," she said, gesturing to a faded map dotted with dates and names. "Disappearances, sudden deaths, strange broadcasts. They all seem to be part of something far older than any of us realized." Tom's mind was only half on the words. His thoughts flickered to Claire, her voice still echoing in his ears, urging him to uncover the truth before it was too late. The radio's static danced faintly, and for a moment he thought he heard her whisper, a soft but clear warning threading through the white noise. Suddenly, the room's atmosphere shifted. A man, seated near the center, his face pale and gaunt, began to tremble violently. His eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and his body convulsed with unnatural force. The murmurs erupted into panicked gasps as an unearthly voice, distorted and layered with static, surged from his lips. "They come, the veil thins. Beware." The man lunged forward, knocking over chairs and sending people scrambling. Tom leapt up, heart pounding, trying to calm the chaos, but the sense of dread was suffocating. The hollow presence had made itself known not just through whispers on the radio, but in flesh and bone. Outside, rain hammered down, a relentless rhythm against the pavement. Tom stood alone, the small radio warm in his hands, Claire's voice cutting through the storm's noise. "You must see beyond the shadows, Tom. Find what lies buried beneath the silence." Her words anchored him, even as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. He thought back to the diary Margaret had found, entries filled with sorrow and fear, chronicling a cycle of grief that fed the very entity now tearing at the seams of reality. That night, memories and present horrors collided. He saw Claire's gentle smile, felt her warmth, then the stark terror of losing her all over again. The line between worlds blurred, but his resolve hardened. He would face whatever lurked beyond the static, for her, for the town, for himself. The hollow presence was no longer just a voice in the static. It was a force growing stronger, and Tom was the last barrier standing between it and the living. He took a deep breath, the cold night air filling his lungs. The fight was just beginning. The town was quiet in the early morning hours, but Tom's mind refused to rest. The violent outburst from the meeting replayed endlessly behind his eyes. He paced the length of his small living room, the radio on the windowsill crackling softly with static. From within the noise, Claire's voice emerged, faint but unmistakable. "Remember the past, Tom. The diary holds the key." He reached for his coat. There was no time to waste. The boundary was thinning, and the longer he waited, the stronger the hollow presence became. He needed Margaret and Eli's help to unlock the secrets before the darkness consumed them all. As dawn broke, Tom stepped into the misty streets, the weight of grief and dread pressing heavily on his shoulders. But beneath it all, a stubborn spark of hope burned. He would find the truth. He had to. In the quiet sanctuary of the library, Margaret spread the ancient diary open across a heavy oak table. The pages were brittle, ink faded, but still legible. Together, they traced the names and dates, piecing together a tapestry of sorrow that spanned generations. Each tragedy seems to coincide with these strange radio signals, Margaret said, her fingers sliding down a page. The hollow presence feeds on grief, growing stronger with every loss. Tom nodded, his fingers trembling as he traced a familiar name. Claire. His chest tightened with a fresh wave of pain. But alongside the grief was clarity. Understanding this pattern was the first step toward breaking it. "We can stop it," he whispered, more to himself than to Margaret. "We have to." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of static, a reminder that the fight was far from over. Later that night, Tom lay in bed, shadows flickering across the walls as the storm raged outside. His thoughts swirled between memories and the present terror. Suddenly, a vivid flashback seized him, Claire's warm smile, the softness of her touch. Then the stark fear in her eyes as she whispered a warning he had never fully understood until now. The room seemed to pulse with the radio's faint hiss, the boundary between memory and reality dissolving. He reached out, as if to grasp something just beyond his fingertips, the line between worlds thinner than ever. "I'm here," Claire's voice echoed, steady and clear amid the chaos. "Hold on, Tom." And in that fragile moment, he found the strength to face the darkness ahead.